So we talked about pulmonary ventilation, which is the mechanism of breathing, in a previous video. Today, or in this video, we're going to talk about external respiration. So in external respiration, this is where we're going to see gas exchange between the alveoli of the lungs and the blood capillaries that are surrounding those alveoli. And in order to be able to understand how that happens and how that works, you have to understand something called partial pressure and something called atmospheric pressure. So in this slide here, you can see the different components of air include nitrogen, oxygen, and carbon dioxide. And you can see there are different percentages of each one of those elements in the air. And you can see that the atmospheric pressure is basically the sum of the pressures exerted separately by each of those gases listed. Now we can calculate what are called the partial pressures of each one of those elements, but the main one that we're going to be concerned with is oxygen, because that's what we need in our cells to be able to produce ATP. So a partial pressure is a separate contribution of each gas. So if we wanted to calculate the partial pressure of oxygen specifically in the air, we could say that oxygen is about 20.9% by volume of the air. And so you can take that, convert it into a decimal, 0.209, and then multiply that times the total atmospheric pressure, which is generally about 760 millimeters of mercury. And you end up with about 159 millimeters of mercury. Now, that's the partial pressure of oxygen in the air. You will see that the partial pressure of oxygen in the blood is a little bit different. It's going to be lower than that. And so this sets up what we call a partial pressure gradient, where we have a difference between the partial pressures of a gas at different points or different areas. So we know that gases typically want to move from a higher partial pressure to a lower partial pressure down their gradient. Okay, so they're going to want to move through diffusion when they do this, through passive transport from a high pressure to a low pressure. So if the partial pressure of oxygen is higher in the atmosphere, when we bring that oxygen into the body, it obviously is going to want to diffuse from the air into the blood, right? It's going to want to unload into the blood where that partial pressure is low. And so this process is called external respiration. This is where, again, we see gas exchange between the alveoli of the lungs and those blood capillaries surrounding the lungs. So this is where we're going to load oxygen into the blood, and we're going to unload carbon dioxide into the alveoli so that we can breathe that carbon dioxide waste out. So when we look at the partial pressures in the air that's in the alveoli versus the partial pressure of oxygen in the blood, we can see that it's much higher in the alveoli whenever we are inhaling and we're bringing that air in. So the partial pressure of oxygen in the alveoli is around 104. It's only 40 in the capillaries. So we know that that oxygen is going to want to diffuse from the alveoli into the blood capillaries. For carbon dioxide, the partial pressure of carbon dioxide is actually going to be higher in the blood because we have created all of this carbon dioxide in our body, right? And it has accumulated in the blood. So that level is going to be higher in the blood capillaries than it is in the alveoli, which means that the carbon dioxide is going to want to leave the capillaries and diffuse into the alveoli, where we can then breathe out and remove it from the body. So here you can kind of see that process and see those numbers and how they change. So again, in inspired air, we have about 159 millimeters of mercury is our partial pressure for oxygen. You can see that drops a little bit as that air enters into the alveoli. By the time it gets into the blood, it's obviously going to drop a lot more. But it's still going to be higher than the oxygen, the partial pressure of oxygen in the tissues, which means that it's going to allow that oxygen to be unloaded from the bloodstream into the tissues, and then carbon dioxide will be picked up from the tissues into those blood capillaries and transported back to the heart and finally back to the lungs. And so you can kind of see in this picture how those partial pressures change from location to location, but we know that these gases are always going to want to move from a high partial pressure to a low partial pressure. So the greater the difference in partial pressure, the faster the diffusion will happen. which is why if someone is having trouble getting oxygen into their blood, you can give them oxygen-enriched air. You can put an oxygen mask on them, give them some pure oxygen, increase the concentration of the oxygen in that air, which will increase the partial pressure of that oxygen, and that will increase the speed at which the oxygen will diffuse from the alveoli into the blood. We also know that we can affect this diffusion rate by affecting membrane thickness, and there are a couple of things that could do this. If you have disorders like pneumonia, where you have fluid in the lungs, or pulmonary edema, swelling, if you have fluid inside of those alveoli, it's going to cause the membrane to be thicker, and that thicker membrane is going to slow down diffusion of oxygen to where you may not be able to get enough into your blood, and hemoglobin is not going to be fully loaded with that oxygen, so you would end up becoming hypoxic, meaning you have low blood oxygen levels. So a lot of times, if a person has pneumonia, they're always very careful to monitor their oxygen content in the blood to make sure that they're getting enough, because if they're not, it can cause some serious problems. We also know that some types of disorders can decrease the membrane surface area of the alveoli, like emphysema, for instance. In emphysema, you have chronic inflammation in those alveoli, and that can decrease the surface area of the alveoli, which can prevent you from being able to allow for diffusion of gases across the alveoli efficiently. And so this can also result in low oxygen levels in the blood, and these people with emphysema typically need supplemental oxygen in order to get their oxygen levels to where they should be. We also know that people that live at higher altitudes, or people that travel to higher altitudes, are going to experience a different atmospheric pressure than those who live at sea level. So the atmospheric pressure at very high altitudes in places like Denver, Colorado, are going to be about 1/3 that of what we see at sea level. So people who live in those areas, their body has to adjust because the oxygen level, is still going to be 21%, but the partial pressure of oxygen may not be enough to drive diffusion into the blood. So this is going to cause the body to do things to accommodate by increasing heart rate, increasing their breathing rate, right, making them breathe a little bit quicker, try to get more oxygen into the body. And it can also do things like increase the production of erythropoietin, which is a hormone that is produced by the kidneys in response to low oxygen levels. And when erythropoietin gets produced, that's going to stimulate us to produce more red blood cells. So people who live at these high altitudes typically will have more red blood cells than other individuals. They typically will have more efficient mitochondria, meaning they're a little bit better at producing ATP with less fuel, less oxygen. And so a lot of times athletes will travel to these higher altitudes to train because it kind of forces their body to acclimate by producing more red blood cells and or by making their mitochondria become more efficient at being able to produce energy. Now, when you're first exposed to these high altitudes, this can sometimes cause some symptoms, things like fatigue, headaches, nausea, and just overall not feeling too great. So if you travel to a high altitude area and go on a hike or something, if you're going backpacking, it's always a good idea to take a day or two to try to acclimate to that high altitude and to that difference in oxygen level than you have at sea level before you really start hiking really hard, because it can cause some detrimental side effects that are not very fun to experience. All right, you guys let me know if you have any questions about external respiration, and in a later video we will go through gas transport.